Welcome back to Let's Talk DeKalb. Joining us now in our DCTV studios is Rabbi Scott Saulson, who's the president of the Ashford Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now we want to get right back into our subject matter at hand. This is the special edition of the Holocaust Remembrance version of Let's Talk DeKalb. So if you would, Rabbi, talk to us about the importance of the annual Holocaust Remembrance.
I'm sure you can speak to philosophers and psychologists who will tell you that remembrance is essential to our growth, and God willing, essential to not repeating mistakes. Sure. And in the case of some of the people that you've been interviewing up until now, remembrance is also, for some of them, is part of a teaching experience to share with other people. And it's a part of a healing experience for some people who, for maybe decades, have not been able to vocalize their personal remembrances and recollections, either for fear that they didn't get it right, and that they were partly imagining things that were too horrible, more horrible than anything that they might have experienced directly, and also because people didn't want to hear. Part of remembering from a religious perspective is also to put yourself in the shoes of others, either because you've experienced their difficulties or joys, or because you haven't, but you need to have that leap of identification so that they feel that they have a partner in life, a spiritual partner in life. So that's really a challenge, and I think, at least for the Christian audience, but for any religious faith, part of it is identifying with the people who went before you, experiencing, as I said before, their joys and their griefs, their history. So remembrance is essential, and yet at the same time it's a great challenge.
Right. During an earlier interview where Aviva Hoffman interviewed Sylvia Wygoda, Sylvia made a pretty profound statement. She said, when you talk about the Holocaust, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. If you can talk to me about the impact of the Holocaust on the Jewish community.
One of the consequences of the Holocaust is that we Jewish people have been impelled or compelled to re-examine our own behavior. What did we do or what did we not do to forestall this? And yet it was such an experience that we had never experienced before. As a community, we weren't practiced, if you will say, to deal with a state devoting its machinery and all of its resources to the elimination of the Jewish people in particular. I would say for most Jews, it's been a theological challenge. I was just listening, for example, the other day on the news reports about the victims of the tornadoes in Alabama.
Right.
So they were interviewing a woman whose family escaped, and she said it was by the grace of God that she escaped. So obviously, she's not thinking, but the observer's thinking, well, does that mean by the grace of God, those who were carried away and killed did not escape?
Right.
You see, because traditionally, when I said self-examination, traditionally the rabbis would have said anything that happens to us that is, quote, bad must have been a consequence of our sinful behavior. And this is something that's abominable to many thinking Jews, to think that somehow we deserved this experience. And yet, the language that we have to incorporate that seems to be, as I said before, this theological language. So that is a consequence that's difficult and paradoxical. And then there's the lesson of how do you, when you're in the position of power, how do you avoid acting out some of the horrendous things that other people did in abusive situations to minority groups? So I would say that's another consequence of the Holocaust for the Jewish people. I think another major consequence, at least speaking for myself, but I think it's related to remembrance, is to not only imagine what it is like to be not only persecuted, but an object of extermination But to imagine yourself in the opposite role. What would I have done? What would you have done had you been in the majority? Had you been the one who's turning a blind eye, or who's lending a hand, or who's offering a hiding place at your own personal risk and the risk of those whom you love,
Right.
to help somebody who has already been labeled a subspecies?
Sure.
Which was the groundwork. You dehumanize somebody, and then it makes it even more difficult for the majority, let's say, to see these people as acceptable. And this is, I think, that theme goes through all persecutions
Sure.
and prejudices, be it racial or be it religious or be it cultural. How to see the person not as an outsider, but but part of your own group, whose differences are not necessarily indicative of superiority or inferiority, but are just indicative that people have different ways of life and different ways of understanding. Variety makes the world go round. So there are many consequences. And then finally, I'm sure you can think of others, is that there's a sense that for some people, the Holocaust was just one aspect of this, what I would call a war of attrition against the Jewish people, that still, in some circles, continues today. I would include in those circles Holocaust deniers, those who would say Hitler didn't finish the job, we ought to finish it, which is sort of contradictory, because if you say he didn't finish the job, how can you deny that he started the job, so to speak? So it's a strange mix of bedfellows in that camp. Somebody once said that no one ever washes a car he rents. You only wash a car that you own.
Right.
And so there's a responsibility that one assumes from one's ownership. One of the challenges to Jewish life and beyond Jewish life post-Holocaust is to preserve factually and spiritually that the Holocaust was primarily a Jewish experience, as Sylvia mentioned, that all Jews kind of were victims, if you will. And yet, to see that there's also something that has a universal implication. That balance. I mean, one could take the experience and universalize it to such an extent that it becomes an un-Jewish experience. Because there were people who were not just Jews,
Absolutely.
who were, as we've talked about, there were gays and there were lesbians and there were political enemies, and there were the mentally ill, and there were the lame, and there were the people who were just considered, as I said, subhuman.
Right.
But the ideological purpose of the whole effort was to exterminate the Jewish people, because of this ideology that said that people are not only different, but they are genetically different in such a way that it can never be rectified. Literally, you can't make a roach into a dog, a pet. So you can't do that. You can only exterminate it. That's how we were looked upon, as vermin. So where I was going with this is that every person has at some point felt to be a stranger, felt to be less than human. So that is a universal experience, and yet there are those who would universalize the Holocaust to such an extent that it would deprive the Jewish people, even of the sad story, of a story that is so integral to our identity.
Right.
So it would be like universalizing the slave experience of African Americans in the United States. Mm-hmm. They're still slaves today around the world. We know that. And yet to say, well, that is just like every other slave experience would be to deprive African Americans of an essential ingredient to their own identity.
Right.
It seems to me. So coming back to remembrance, one of the important things about remembrance is, theoretically, it's part of the prevention for the reoccurrence. because we're not so stupid to know that it cannot happen again. And the slogan may say never again, but the slogan implies that it can happen again. So just sitting back and saying, well, something bad happened, lightning's not going to strike twice. No, you need to get a lightning rod. You know, if your house is burned down once, you say it's not going to hit again. No, you get a lightning rod. So part of remembrance is to have a lightning rod to alert us when these things are about to take place, so we can nip them in the bud.
Then my final question for you is, if you were to issue a charge to our viewers on DCTV to say, you know what, this is something that we can all learn from, this is something we can all grow from, how would you issue that charge to our viewers?
Try to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes without losing your own identity. And, you know, the appeal in this day and age, at least in this last year or two, is to be more tolerant towards other people, to be more accepting towards other people. This is the old religious point of view. We've been preaching it for millennia. Maybe that's sort of sad that it hasn't sunk in. I don't know. But this is nothing new. Every faith has said to see in your neighbor yourself. The challenge is to live out that teaching. I would say hold that teaching in front of you, not as something to put on a shelf to admire, but something to integrate into your own life.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Rabbi Saulson, for joining us today on Let's Talk DeKalb.
My pleasure.
Stick around. We'll be back with more right after the break.